When All Elite Wrestling first burst onto the scene in 2019, fans were hyped. Finally, an alternative, a major competitor to WWE in decades, and for a while, AEW delivered exactly what wrestling fans had been craving. Fresh stories, dream matches becoming reality, CM Punk making his earth-shattering return to wrestling after nearly a decade away, stars like Kenny Omega, MJF, and Darby Allin finally getting national TV exposure alongside household names like Chris Jericho, Jon Moxley, Sting, and even guys like Bryan Danielson and Adam Cole choosing AEW over WWE. Times were exciting, and it looked like AEW was destined to change pro wrestling forever. But somewhere down the line, it looks like All Elite Wrestling has just pretty much lost its way. The excitement has faded, the novelty has worn off, and even the hardcore All Elite enthusiasts are tuning out and wondering if this is the same company that once promised to change the face of pro wrestling. So what caused this paradigm shift? What made AEW go from a legit competitor to barely staying relevant? How did it go from jam-packed stadiums to half-empty arenas? And how did the ratings go from hitting almost 1 million to getting thrashed by WWE's developmental brand NXT? Well, this is Grease from Wrestleology, and today we'll answer all those questions and much more as we dive deep into the downfall and future of All Elite Wrestling.
Oh my God! He wants me to work with pricks constantly. That's what it is.
Let's rewind the clock back to All In 2023. What was supposed to be the biggest show in the history of the company ironically marked the beginning of its downfall. Prior to his match versus Samoa Joe, the real AEW World Champion CM Punk got into a backstage altercation with Jungle Boy Jack Perry. And this wasn't the first time Punk was linked to backstage drama in AEW. Just a few months prior, Punk had gotten into a backstage fight with the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega after going off on Hangman Page during the infamous Brawl Out incident. This situation led to both Punk and the Bucks getting suspended from AEW. On his return to Collision in June 2023, Punk would claim himself as the real AEW World Champion, and it looked like all this was leading to a dream feud between MJF and Punk to determine the undisputed AEW World Champion later down the road. But a certain scapegoat had other plans. During a match on Collision, Jungle Boy Jack Perry wanted to use real glass in a segment, but Punk, being the veteran, advised against it for safety reasons. Apparently, Jack took offense to this advice and mocked Punk in front of the whole world, and he said,
Jack Perry launching and then crushing
real glass.
Crushing the
Don't
abdomen.
cry me a river.
And in my opinion, down the line, this is going to be one of the biggest butterfly effects in wrestling history, period. Punk would go on to quit AEW and return to WWE to one of the loudest pops in history, and even compete side by side with Roman Reigns in War Games. Yeah, imagine telling that to someone 2 years ago. But this wasn't even the worst part. What really damaged AEW's credibility was how Tony Khan handled the whole situation. In April 2024, long after Punk had left the company, AEW would air footage of the backstage altercation between Punk and Jack Perry, which many claimed was for cheap publicity and a desperate attempt to get some eyes on the product. And this has been a common theme in AEW, relying on real-life drama instead of coming up with creative storylines that keep the audience engaged. Now, don't get me wrong, there are times when AEW will come up with some great storytelling, like when Hangman won the title against Kenny Omega, or the recent Swerve versus Hangman saga where both men were legitimately trying to end each other's careers. But most AEW storylines simply fall flat and lack the compelling drama and character development that keeps viewers invested week after week. I mean, let's just take the Adam Cole MJF Devil storyline for example. It was supposed to be the biggest story for AEW heading into All In 2023. And I remember when this summer was happening, this was the most I've ever been invested into AEW. The bromance was captivating, the fans were invested, and everyone was eagerly speculating who would stab who in the back first. But what followed was a massive disappointment. While Cole would reveal himself as the Devil and form the Undisputed Kingdom, he would get injured shortly after, and the Devil storyline would be left hanging, never getting the proper conclusion that it deserved. And these injuries have been a major thorn in AEW's side for quite a long time now, with top names in the company like Kenny Omega, Adam Copeland, and Eddie Kingston being out of action for months due to injury. It has really hurt AEW's star power in a massive way. But injuries aren't the biggest reason that has led to AEW's decline. The biggest reason behind AEW's downfall is something that has been present since the company's early days and has become more apparent in recent months. months. When AEW first burst onto the scene, fans were super excited to finally have fresh faces on national television. They were thrilled to have names like Kenny Omega, MJF, Hangman Page, and the Young Bucks, guys who really made their name in the indies, and promotions like New Japan Pro Wrestling and Ring of Honor finally getting the spotlight that they deserved. And with names like Jon Moxley, Chris Jericho, and Bryan Danielson coming into the mix, the fans couldn't wait for all the dream matches to unfold. But amidst all the dream match excitement, Tony Khan and company seem to have forgotten one of the biggest elements that makes pro wrestling special, the one thing that keeps fans glued to their screens and keeps them coming back week after week. You see, if we take a quick glance at WWE today, the Bloodline saga has been going on for almost 5 years, but even now there are always new developments. There's always something that keeps the fans invested. Every match, every segment seems to serve some purpose in the big picture, whether it's Kevin Owens beating the hell out of Cody Rhodes for siding with Roman Reigns, whether it's Drew McIntyre targeting and taking out Sami Zayn and Jey Uso for realigning with Roman Reigns, whether it's Seth Rollins refusing to align with the OG Bloodline for War Games, every piece ties together into a smooth narrative. That's what makes compelling TV. And it's not just now. Let's look at the biggest feuds in wrestling history, whether it's Rock versus Austin, Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker, John Cena versus Edge, or even Daniel Bryan winning the world title, overcoming the Authority at WrestleMania. Each great moment has had one crucial element that made it memorable. But All Elite Wrestling seems to have lost sight in the basic wrestling principle. They keep booking these dream matches with little to no build at all. Whether it's a pay-per-view like Forbidden Door or an episode of Collision, most AEW cards seem like randomly thrown together matches at the last minute instead of payoffs for compelling stories that the fans want to watch. And in my opinion, this is the biggest reason that's turning even hardcore AEW fans into skeptics. I mean, look at the current state of AEW. The biggest story currently is Jon Moxley basically turning himself into NWO Hulk Hogan, holding the company hostage and rebuilding it in his own image. Now, I'm not going to be a Debbie Downer and dismiss the storyline before it even gets a chance to play out, but looking at AEW's history with such stories, I honestly don't really expect a huge payoff. And I mean, just look at the whole AEW versus the Elite saga, which started hot with the Bucks and Okada taking out Kenny Omega and Tony Khan on TV. But what did that lead to? Yeah, you're right, nothing at all. And speaking of Okada, oh boy, let's talk about AEW's booking of Okada. This is one of the biggest stars in Japanese wrestling in the last decade. I mean, just look at Okada from any Wrestle Kingdom show. The aura is off the charts. The man is treated like a god, a true main event star rivaling the presence of names like CM Punk and maybe even Roman Reigns. But ever since Okada joined AEW, he's been relegated to the upper mid-card, wrestling on Collision, and comedic bits like this.
The new audience, I guess.
I pressed the wrong button. I'm so sorry! Bitch.
Now, I love a good comedy and a bit of wrestling, but if that's the best you can come up with for one of the biggest names outside WWE in the past 10 years, then there's some serious soul searching to be done, Tony Khan. And it's not just Okada who has been mishandled. Let's talk about the questionable booking of guys like Malachi Black, Miro, or Keith Lee. It seems to be a reoccurring pattern at this point. Big name signs with AEW, they get the All Elite graphic, they get hyped for 2 weeks, and then they get lost in the shuffle. Next thing you know, the wrestling on Collision or Rampage. It's like Tony Khan has way too many toys and he doesn't know what to do with them. The same has been the case with Mercedes Moné. When Mercedes, formerly known as Sasha Banks, first arrived in AEW, fans thought the AEW women's division was finally going to be resurrected. And while things looked quite promising for a few weeks with some tension between Britt Baker and Moné, the CEO's arrival hasn't quite lived up to the expectations. The booking of these stars just seems all over the place. No long-term plans, just thrown together matches and segments. Well, except the booking of one Chris Jericho, which has been consistent, and by consistent, I mean consistently awful, okay? All of Jericho's storylines, from the Inner Circle to JAS to the Learning Tree, all seem to follow the same pattern, and the fans have made it evident that they don't like it at all.
New title for the Mozart of the mat game. The Learning Tree, Chris Jericho, who has already taught plenty of people. Hook.
This is a big problem. And speaking of problems, let's address the elephant in the room, the sheer number of championships in AEW. At this point, it feels like everyone and their grandmother has a title. When you have multiple world championships, multiple tag team championships, and titles that barely get defended or even shown on TV, it dilutes the importance of being a champion. Now, you could make the same argument for WWE now because they're starting to create the women mid-card titles and they had the Crown Jewel one, but let's be honest, the Crown Jewel one is like only a one-time thing a year. I feel like the only title in WWE that really doesn't matter is probably the Women's Tag Team Championship, but everything else at least is made important even a little bit on TV, unlike some of these AEW titles. But all of these issues ultimately point to one central problem: Tony Khan's leadership, or rather the lack thereof. Look, I'll give credit where it's due. Khan's passion for professional wrestling is undeniable. He's a lifelong fan who managed to create a legitimate alternative to WWE, but being a passionate fan doesn't automatically make you a good booker or leader. The signs have been there from the beginning too. Instead of taking feedback from the vets in the business or listening to the broader audience, Tony Khan seems to be more focused on pleasing a small vocal section of the internet wrestling community. He's booking shows like a fan playing with action figures rather than a promoter building compelling, long-term storylines and characters that draw money. What's even more concerning though is his lack of backbone when it comes to making tough decisions. Whether it's being unable to tell the talents no when they pitch ideas that don't make sense, or his reluctance to streamline the bloated roster, Khan seems more interested in being the cool boss rather than being an effective leader. Just look at his Twitter behavior, constantly defending ratings, making excuses for poor attendance, and getting into arguments with critics instead of focusing on improving the product. That is not what a leader of a major wrestling company should be doing. As a result, the product feels directionless, storylines start and stop without proper resolution, talents get lost in the shuffle, and the actual audience in arenas keeps shrinking while Khan celebrates the social media engagement numbers. Remember the Dynamite ratings that once threatened to overtake Raw in 2019 to 2020? They're now struggling to maintain 500,000 viewers and are constantly getting beat by NXT, dude. Yet instead of addressing these fundamental issues, we get more titles, more random debuts, and more excuses from Tony Khan. So what's next for All Elite Wrestling? Well, the company still has some bright spots. When they get it right, like with the recent Swerve Strickland and Hangman storyline, or some of the recent Will Ospreay matches, they show glimpses of what made fans fall in love with AEW in the first place. But for AEW to truly turn things around, some major changes need to happen. First and foremost, they need to simplify things, cut down the number of titles, and focus on building compelling stories with the incredible talent that they already have rather than constantly bringing in new faces. They need to stop relying on dream matches and start building proper feuds again. Give us reasons to care about these matches and watch the shows beyond just these two good wrestlers are gonna wrestle. Remember how invested fans were in the Hangman Page story on his road to overcoming self-doubt and winning the AEW World Championship? That's the kind of long-term storytelling that made AEW special. The company also desperately needs someone with creative experience to help guide the ship. Tony Khan clearly has passion and knowledge of wrestling history, but his booking decisions suggest that he needs help structuring the shows and telling coherent stories. Whether that's bringing in experienced writers or listening to more of the veterans in the locker room, something there needs to change 100%. And most importantly, AEW needs to rediscover its identity. What made them different from WWE wasn't just the in-ring style, it was their ability to tell authentic stories that felt fresh and exciting. They need to stop trying to be WWE light and start trying to be AEW again. The only thing that really did kind of change for the AEW and WWE like war was the fact that WWE is just genuinely a better product right now than it was in 2019 to 2020. But when it comes to AEW, I mean, the talent is there, the resources are there, the fans still want AEW to succeed, but unless these fundamental issues are addressed, we might be watching the slow decline of what could have been one of the biggest success stories in pro wrestling history. It'll be interesting to see what the future holds for AEW going into 2025. I certainly hope that the company can bounce back and truly rebuild itself. But if the recent Rey Fenix Twitter drama is any indication, then things don't really look too promising. But let me know what you think. Will AEW survive 2025? What changes do you think the company needs to make? And what do you believe is the biggest reason behind the current downward spiral of AEW? Thank you so much for watching, and subscribe if you enjoyed.